It was a brisk Wednesday morning, November 2, 2016, when Keith Papini returned to his quiet, Redding, California home and realized something wasn't right. His wife, Sherri Papini, hadn't picked up their children from daycare, and her phone calls had gone unanswered all day. Panic started to rise in his chest. This wasn't like Sherri. She was a devoted mother, meticulous about routines, and fiercely protective of her family. He drove to the daycare in hopes of finding her there, but she never showed. Hours passed. Then, something disturbing surfaced. Sherri's iPhone, earbuds still tangled and strands of her blonde hair stuck to them, was discovered lying along a rural stretch of Sunrise Drive, near the spot where she usually jogged. There were no signs of a struggle. No witnesses. No vehicle seen leaving the area. Just silence, and a trail of fear beginning to build. By nightfall, Keith had reported her missing, and Shasta County Sheriff's deputies were sweeping the area. Local media picked up the story almost immediately. Missing posters went up. Social media lit up with pleas for help. And as each hour ticked by with no word from Sherri, the case began to feel heavier. Darker. The public response was swift and emotional. Sherri Papini was 34 years old, the quintessential image of the American wife and mother, slender, smiling, and adored by her small-town community. Married to Keith since 2009, she was often seen volunteering at her children's school and jogging along the same wooded roads that now pulsed with search parties. As law enforcement intensified their efforts, the nation's eyes turned to this quiet corner of Northern California. Within days, helicopters scanned the dense forestry. FBI agents stepped in. Volunteers combed trails. The Papini home became the epicenter of hope and dread. And Keith, desperate for answers, sat down for a televised interview and choked through tears, describing the agony of not knowing where his wife had gone. He spoke directly to her. "I'm so sorry, honey. I'm trying so hard," he said, visibly trembling. "Everybody is looking for you." Sherri's sudden vanishing sparked endless speculation. Was this a random abduction? A targeted kidnapping? Had she been taken by someone she knew? Law enforcement ruled out Keith quickly. He passed a polygraph and offered full cooperation. Surveillance footage from nearby homes was reviewed. Highway checkpoints were activated. Still, nothing. What struck investigators early on was the lack of any ransom demand. If this had been an abduction for financial gain, someone should have called. But the silence remained unbroken. It was as if Sherri had simply vanished from the earth. Then, 22 days later, everything changed. On Thanksgiving morning, November 24, 2016, a driver reported seeing a disoriented woman on the side of County Road 17 in Yolo County, over 140 miles south of where Sherri had disappeared. She was dirty, bruised, and had a chain wrapped around her waist. A tattooed brand had been seared into her shoulder. It was Sherri Papini. She had returned. Within hours, she was rushed to the hospital. Photos were kept private, but police later confirmed that her nose had been broken, her body was covered in cuts and bruises, and she had lost significant weight. She barely spoke, terrified and withdrawn. But what little she did say shocked investigators. According to Sherri, she had been kidnapped by two Hispanic women who had pulled up in a dark SUV while she was jogging. She claimed they held her at gunpoint, forced her inside the vehicle, and took her to a location where she was chained to a piece of furniture. Over the course of 3 weeks, she said, she had been beaten, burned, and branded. Her hair was hacked off. She was threatened constantly. At one point, she claimed to hear them arguing in Spanish over whether to kill her. And then, just as suddenly as she had been taken, she said they dumped her along the roadside in the early hours of Thanksgiving, face covered with a bag, still chained, and left her for dead. The story was horrifying. National media exploded with headlines like "Supermom Survives Brutal Kidnapping" and "Sherri Papini's Miraculous Escape." She was praised as courageous, resilient, even heroic. Donations flowed in. Well-wishers flooded the family's home. Everyone wanted to know how she had endured so much. Behind the scenes, though, law enforcement harbored doubts. There were inconsistencies, tiny ones at first, but impossible to ignore. For starters, Sherri's detailed description of her captors failed to match any existing profiles. She claimed they wore masks but could recall vivid physical details. She remembered very specific conversations they allegedly had but couldn't remember how she got from one location to another. And although she described physical abuse, some of the injuries appeared self-inflicted or superficial in nature. Then there was the branding. It was real, but crude. Investigators questioned why it would be done in such a sloppy fashion by supposedly sophisticated traffickers. And when police requested to interview Sherri again to clarify her account, she refused. She declined further interviews, stopped cooperating entirely, and, through her husband, said she was too traumatized. Still, the investigation dragged on for years. The FBI tested DNA found on her clothing, the only real lead they had. In 2020, that DNA produced a match. But it wasn't to a stranger. It belonged to James Reyes, Sherri's ex-boyfriend, who lived in Costa Mesa, hundreds of miles away. Reyes told agents he hadn't kidnapped Sherri, she had asked him to help her run away. Suddenly, everything changed again. The woman who had cried wolf on a national scale was no longer a survivor, she was now a suspect. And the house of lies she had built over the years was on the verge of collapse. What had really happened during those missing 22 days? Who was the real Sherri Papini behind the media frenzy, the hospital bed, the tearful reunion? The answers were darker than anyone could have predicted. And far from over. When Sherri Papini reappeared on Thanksgiving morning in 2016, she was treated like a survivor of an unthinkable nightmare. But behind the public's sympathetic gaze, investigators were quietly watching her story begin to fracture. And they weren't the only ones growing suspicious. From the outset, detectives had difficulty reconciling Sherri's version of events with the evidence, or lack thereof. Her injuries were real, yes, but their origin was uncertain. The wounds on her arms and legs, described initially as the result of captivity and torture, were oddly shallow. Uniform. Some bore the look of hesitation marks. Others appeared patterned, like someone referencing a mirror or list. None showed the ragged trauma typical of being held in chains for over 3 weeks. Her bruises were in unusual locations and healed unevenly, suggesting they hadn't all occurred in the same time frame. And though her nose had been broken, it was a clean break, more like something that might occur during a fall, not from a violent beating. Then there was the brand. Etched crudely into her shoulder was a symbol authorities never revealed publicly. Sherri claimed it was a punishment from her captors, something to mark her as property. But the branding looked amateurish. There was no clear gang symbolism, no pattern matching cartel behavior. One expert said it looked more like someone trying to fake what they imagined a branding would look like, rather than a calculated mark from an organized criminal network. Despite the FBI's questions, Sherri stonewalled further interviews. She avoided meetings. Through her husband Keith, she expressed mental anguish and debilitating fear. She claimed the trauma left her unable to sleep, eat, or function. But Keith himself became increasingly unreachable to investigators. He cancelled appointments. He asked that all communication be written. He requested attorneys to sit in on meetings. The walls were going up fast, and the FBI wasn't buying it. Then came the DNA. For years, there had only been one physical clue, an unknown male DNA profile found on Sherri's underwear. The hit came in 2020, and it sent shockwaves through the case. It didn't belong to one of the imaginary Hispanic women. It belonged to James Reyes, Sherri's former flame from back in her youth. Reyes was living quietly in Costa Mesa, working in a music store, keeping out of trouble. He hadn't seen Sherri in years, until 2016. When agents knocked on his door, Reyes didn't hesitate. He invited them in. He didn't lawyer up. And he didn't lie. What he told them flipped the entire case inside out. According to Reyes, Sherri had contacted him months before her kidnapping, reigniting communication through secret prepaid phones. She said she needed to get away from her husband and her life. She claimed Keith was abusive, that her marriage was failing, and that she couldn't be a mother anymore. Reyes admitted he still had feelings for her. So when she asked for help, he agreed. They arranged a plan. He drove from Costa Mesa to Redding and picked her up. There was no force, no weapon. Sherri climbed into his car willingly, ducked out of sight, and stayed with him in his apartment for over 3 weeks. They watched TV. She cooked. He says she did not appear scared. She cut her own hair. She even hit herself to create bruises. Reyes said he begged her not to. He described watching helplessly as she burned herself with a heated metal tool in the bathroom mirror to create the brand. She claimed she needed the injuries to make her story believable when she went back home. Reyes said he never touched her sexually. He said they never rekindled romance. He slept on the couch. She slept in the bedroom. He believed he was helping a broken woman who needed an escape. But by the end, he realized he'd been manipulated. When she asked him to drive her north and drop her on the side of the road, he didn't protest. He said he helped her put the chain around her waist and zip-tied her wrists loosely to look convincing. She wept and thanked him. Then she vanished back into the world. When agents confronted Sherri with Reyes' testimony in 2020, she denied everything. She insisted she had been kidnapped, tortured, and dumped. But the DNA didn't lie. The burner phones were traced. Reyes' story matched timeframes and messages. Eventually, she stopped cooperating entirely. The public didn't know any of this. Not yet. For nearly 6 years, Sherri Papini maintained the image of a traumatized mother who had barely escaped death. She collected over $30,000 from the California Victim Compensation Board. She accepted GoFundMe donations. She resumed life in Reading, homeschooled her children, and kept silent. But the case was very much alive. On March 3, 2022, Sherri Papini was arrested and charged with making false statements to federal agents and mail fraud related to the victim compensation funds. In the criminal complaint, the truth was laid bare: Sherri's kidnapping was a hoax. She had lied to the FBI, misled her community, and defrauded the system. The town of Reading was stunned. Supporters who had prayed for her return now felt betrayed. Neighbors who had offered comfort felt duped. And perhaps most painful, her husband, Keith, stood shattered in the center of it all. He filed for divorce shortly after her arrest, seeking full custody of their 2 children. In court filings, he wrote that Sherri was not acting in a rational manner and that her actions had traumatized their children. The backlash was swift. Online commenters labeled her a narcissist, a liar, a manipulator. News anchors who once sympathized now condemned her as the "gone girl of Reading." And victims of real abduction cases came forward to say Sherri had done untold damage to the credibility of women who truly suffer. Even so, the question persisted: why? Why fake your own abduction? Why stage injuries, burn your own skin, and brand your own body? Why drag an old boyfriend into the chaos? Why disappear for 22 days while your children cried for you? Was it desperation? A craving for attention? A need to escape? Or something darker, a pattern of pathological deceit? In the coming months, as court proceedings unfolded, a clearer portrait of Sherri Papini would emerge. Not as a helpless victim, but as a compulsive manipulator with a long history of deception. One who had rehearsed her performance down to the finest wound. And the real unraveling hadn't even begun. By the time the handcuffs clicked around Sherri Papini's wrists in March 2022, the story that had transfixed a nation was already in flames. Her arrest brought vindication for law enforcement, shock for the public, and ruin for the Papini family. But the most unsettling part was this: none of it was new information to investigators, they'd known for years. What finally broke the stalemate was the weight of the evidence, and the knowledge that justice delayed was no longer justice at all. When Sherri was taken into custody, she showed no remorse. Her booking photo displayed the same familiar blankness the public had seen since her rescue in 2016. But now the makeup was gone. The facade had crumbled. And behind the carefully crafted mask stood a woman who had lied at every turn, without blinking. The charges were damning. She wasn't just accused of lying to federal agents, she was accused of defrauding the state and the people who had trusted her. According to the indictment, Sherri Papini had accepted over $30,000 from the California Victim Compensation Board between 2017 and 2021, money meant for real victims of crime. She used it to pay for therapy sessions, hospital visits, and even personal expenses. All of it based on a fictional story she clung to until the very end. Court documents revealed even more chilling layers to the case. Sherri had a documented history of deceit dating back to her youth. Old acquaintances described her as manipulative, willing to say anything to gain attention or sympathy. At age 20, she had once blamed her mother for abusing her, an allegation later retracted. Former partners recounted bizarre behaviors and unpredictable moods. She had, they said, always been a performer. But no one could have imagined she would stage her own kidnapping. At her bail hearing, prosecutors argued that she was a flight risk and a danger to the integrity of the justice system. Her defense team pushed back, portraying her as a fragile woman struggling with mental health issues, claiming she posed no threat to society. The judge ultimately granted her release on $120,000 bond, but it came with restrictions. She was fitted with a GPS ankle monitor and placed under house arrest at her family's home. The most painful blow came not from the court, but from her husband, Keith. Days after her arrest, he filed for divorce and full custody of their children. In a public statement, he wrote, "I am deeply saddened by the pain my children have endured, and by the betrayal I feel. I believed her. I defended her. And now I have to explain to our kids that their mother lied about everything." The case against her was airtight. In April 2022, Sherri Papini signed a plea deal. She admitted to faking her abduction, lying to federal agents, and committing mail fraud. The hoax had been meticulously planned: burner phones, prepaid cards, isolated locations. But no amount of planning could keep the truth buried forever. At her sentencing hearing in September 2022, federal prosecutors didn't hold back. They labeled her actions deliberate, calculated, and cruel. They emphasized the emotional and financial cost of the investigation, over $150,000 in public resources spent chasing imaginary kidnappers. FBI agents had traveled across states, reviewed surveillance footage, tested DNA, followed dead-end leads, all because of a woman who wanted to vanish from her life and return as a hero. Sherri stood before the judge, weeping. She apologized to her children, her husband, law enforcement, and the public. But many questioned the sincerity behind her tears. Was it remorse, or regret that she'd been caught? The court sentenced her to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 36 months of supervised release. She was also ordered to pay $309,902 in restitution to state and federal agencies. It was the maximum penalty allowed under her plea agreement, and it still didn't feel like enough to those she had hurt. Sherri began serving her sentence in November 2022 at the Federal Correctional Institution in Victorville, California, a far cry from the quiet, middle-class life she had once portrayed. Behind bars, she became a ghost in the headlines, a woman whose name had once sparked candlelight vigils and teary reunions, now reduced to a cautionary tale. But the echoes of her deception haven't faded. For law enforcement, the Papini case left a bitter scar. It diverted resources from real victims, cases that went cold while agents chased a lie. It endangered public trust in missing persons reports and traumatized officers who spent years believing they were hunting human traffickers. Some of those agents have since retired, disillusioned. For victims of actual kidnappings, Sherri's lie did untold harm. Advocates for missing women and children were outraged. One survivor of a real abduction case called Sherri's actions a betrayal to every person who's ever had to claw their way out of a nightmare. And for the public, the story remains a jarring reminder of how easily truth can be twisted into spectacle. The beautiful mother with the haunting eyes. The husband clutching her photograph. The children waiting for a mother who was never really gone. The community that rallied, then recoiled. Even now, some continue to defend her. They say she snapped. That she was unwell. That she needed help, not handcuffs. But the court didn't agree. And neither did the mountain of evidence she left in her wake. Sherri Papini may one day walk free. She may try to reclaim her life, rewrite her narrative, even seek redemption. But the damage is permanent. She didn't just scar herself with that crude brand, she carved a deep wound into the trust of an entire nation. And for many, that's a mark that will never fade. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. For more content like this, please like this video and subscribe to my channel.